All stem from two mistakes. Two mistakes in your own half, you get punished. Dupree knows that. One bad kick from the scrum, and then the pass is a bad decision. And now momentum and energy is with the Cherry and Whites.
They stick with their kicking game, and Thorley's racing across, still busy drying his hands as he takes the ball. And he's got it away nicely. Cipriani, there are three men on the outside, but he's been caught. And here's Marlon Yards setting off for the try line. No one will deny
him. How does that happen? Gloucester had all the momentum. The Cherry and Whites had all the momentum. And then Sale scored 5 seconds after Austin Healey said they had all the momentum. How could that possibly happen? Unless, of course, maybe momentum doesn't actually exist. And I'm aware this is kind of quite a controversial thing to talk about because it's such a conventional wisdom that momentum doesn't exist. Anyone who sort of plays rugby talks about how they feel momentum shift. They can feel when they have momentum or when it's getting away from you. It's so intrinsic in the way we talk about rugby. But I don't think there's any sort of tangible evidence that it does actually exist. And I'm not talking about physics and momentum, right? The laws of dynamics. That probably does exist. And I did a physics degree. So if it doesn't exist, my university... Ooh, they lied to me big time. Although they did also tell me the world was round, so who knows what else they could have been lying about. But I am, of course, talking about momentum in that more sort of intangible thing that we feel when one team kind of gets on top and then suddenly they have the momentum. They're making all the better decisions, making all the better plays, and the rub of the green seems to go for them, right? I don't think that exists. And I guess one of the easiest ways of sort of saying what momentum actually is, or what we think momentum is it's lots of things sort of happening that are good for the same team and us confusing that for momentum. It's the same way that when you flip a coin, you know, if you flip a coin lots and lots of times, eventually you'll get a streak of about 7 or 8 heads. And that doesn't mean that heads has momentum. We know the next thing to happen is still 50-50 between heads and tails. But when we sort of think about that in sport, even if it was 50-50 between two teams doing a thing, if we get 4 or 5 good things happening for a team, we think they have momentum. And one of the reasons for this is human beings are very, very, very good at spotting patterns. But sometimes it means we spot patterns in things that are actually just random and unconnected. So one way I'm going to illustrate that is if you ask people to draw a scatter graph that's totally random, they'll probably end up drawing something like this. It's upside down. So what you can see there is what looks like a seemingly random distribution of dots. But actually that isn't really random. I mean, it could be random. But when there's such an even spacing, it's probably not random. It's me sort of drawing a dot on the basis of where a previous dot is or isn't. As if you actually do random scatter graphs, they look more like this. What you actually get is clusters, so lots of dots grouped together. And the way the human brain works is being like, oh, there must be something connecting these. But of course, it's just random. And that is just a random scatter graph that I've been making in Excel using the random number generator. Computer nerds will be like, well, it's not truly random. I know, but I'm not going to do all the crazy things they do to truly generate random, which involves raindrops and plants and all sorts of other stuff. I guess a good example of this is that Apple actually had to make their shuffle feature, or what was their random feature, less random because people thought it wasn't random enough. So what happens is you'll be listening to music, you know, and 2 songs from the same album come on one after another. You know, you're listening to Dancing in the Dark by Bruce Springsteen, and suddenly the next song is Born in the USA. How can that possibly happen? That doesn't seem random. That's the way the human brain works, but actually that is random. That happens quite a lot in random sequences, is that you do get these clusters. And a good way of talking about that in sport is a thing called the hot hand fallacy. And this is something associated with basketball. And there's a really good Numberphile video about this that I'll link below. And it's essentially the idea that someone's more likely to get their next shot in basketball because they're on a hot streak, because they've got previous shots. And the data kind of doesn't really support this, that it makes you actually any better to get the next shot in. There's actually a basketball player called JJ Redick, who's quite a good basketball player, had lots of college records, but he also went to Duke, which is like one of the top 10 universities in America, incredibly good university. So not just a good basketball player, really smart guy. And he actually tested this on himself. So what he would do is he just practiced shooting hoops, shooting free throws, and then suddenly he'd be like, right, I'm in rhythm now. Let's see if I get the next shot. And he found there was absolutely no such thing as the hot hand observing himself. He came to that same conclusion. Now, there is more data and a lot smarter data that suggests that maybe it does exist. There is a hot hand thing. But what people think about it in like this sort of conventional way is this sort of 20-30% boost, when actually it's probably only about sort of 2 or 3%. It's really tiny. And that's just one player in basketball. That's not a whole rugby team, which is 15 moving parts that, you touch the ball way less. As basketball, one player can make a massive difference. But in rugby, if it's just one player getting that 2 or 3% extra, it's so negligible across the whole team. So I tried to look at it in rugby, and I looked at a couple of games from this season. Again, it's only a 10-game sample size, and I wish it was bigger. But I looked at who scored next after a team scores. And after a team scores, they only score next 46% of the time, which is interesting. So if you score, you're actually less likely to score next, which sort of defies that conventional wisdom about momentum. One of the reasons for this is probably that the restart actually isn't a truly even way to start the game. The team that kicks off does get a slight boost. It might also, in a larger sample size, actually go towards 50-50, or there might be a slight momentum thing. But that's just the sort of... It's still about 100 data points that I looked at, and I wish I could be bigger, but I'm just one man, and it takes a while to collect this bits of data. And I'm trying to do it for lots of things. So that's kind of interesting that you're less likely to score next after scoring. And what about going game to game? Right, so I looked at this for the 2018-2019 Premiership season, and teams actually only win 42% of the time after winning the previous game. And on average by team, a team's winning percentage drops by about 10% after they've won the previous game. So clearly that momentum isn't carrying into the next game. They're somehow more likely to lose the next game, which also doesn't kind of make sense on its own. And I think, having not looked into this in too much detail, I would assume that because there is a disparity between winning at home and winning away, you're more likely to win at home and your next game is more likely to be away. Because, as we sort of talked about in the nature of random, right, scheduling isn't random. After you've played a home game, you are more likely to play an away game. Otherwise, teams would have 8 home games in a row or 8 away games in a row in some seasons, and that just doesn't happen. So you are more likely to play an away game after a home game, which means you're probably more likely to lose. In the same way that you've probably played a bad team when you've got the win, or you'll be more likely to play a bad team, so therefore the next week you're going to play a better team. So that might be one of the reasons that explains it. But I texted my dad those results and sort of talked about, well, maybe it's because of this. And he sort of said, well, I guess if you have momentum, you should be able to take that into away games and against better teams anyway. So I found that kind of interesting. And there is definitely more data you can talk about. And I've talked about stuff in very small sample sizes I am, because unfortunately I am just one guy, and I would like to try and take more and more and more. But I want to take data about lots of things, and there probably is an easy way of doing that, and we could look at more than 10 games. But I will, like a lot of these videos, I want it to be the start of a discussion. I don't think this is the final answer. I don't think this is the conclusion. If anything, it's just a sort of hypothesis with a little bit of data behind it. It isn't a scientific paper, but we're just trying to put it out there. And I really want to get people sort of thinking about things and trying to challenge those conventional wisdoms. And I think that's a really good one to challenge about momentum and form as well, which kind of the same points are made there about form possibly doesn't exist. A lot of smart stats people think it doesn't exist, and if it does, it's negligible. So maybe all those international coaches are doing the right thing, not picking the informed players. But yeah, thanks very much for watching. It's obviously not an incredibly professional setup. I'm sat cross-legged on my sofa next to some lovely flowery pillows. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this, and do the like and subscribe thing, I guess. Or you don't have to if you don't want to. Do if you do. I'm happier if you just go away and think about it. That's the real victory. I'm gonna go now. Bye.